Okay, it's 10 o'clock. I shall start recording now.
Welcome everyone to this meeting of the Swansea Local Pensions Board. We are up against some time constraints this morning as one of our members has to leave. So without further ado, can I go to the first item on the agenda, which is the minutes of the previous meeting?
Sorry, Chair, apologies.
Oh,
It's apologies.
apologies. Yes.
Yeah, apologies from Councillor Ryland Doyle and from Rosemary Broad.
Okay, and I suppose we ought to have declarations of interest before the minutes. I need to declare an interest in the agenda as a whole, as I'm a member of the LGPS. Any other declarations from my fellow members?
Chair, I'd like to declare an interest as also a member of the pension committee as well, as a member of the pension as well.
Thank you.
Me too. I'm also a member. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah,
Any?
and myself, Chair, I'm a member as well.
Okay. You're going to have to call out, I think, rather than giving me indications by waving, because I'm on one screen here.
So sorry, Chairman. I'd like to make a declaration, member of the LGPS, for the agenda as a whole. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair. Karen Cobb, I'd like to make a declaration. I'm a member of the LGPS.
Morning, Karen.
Is there anybody who hasn't declared and feels they need to? I'm seeing no and hearing no indications, so I'll take that as completing the declarations. And I think, Jeremy, you've circulated the usual form to be completed.
Yes, if everybody can complete and return to me. Thank you.
So moving on to the minutes of the last meeting. They've been circulated. So could I have an indication of somebody moving them for accuracy?
I'll move them for accuracy, Chair. I'm happy with the minutes.
Thank you. And anybody against or abstaining? And I'm seeing no indications. Thank you. And any matters arising? I'm seeing no indications. So what we've agreed to do is to rejig the order slightly so that we can devote proper time to the valuation report. And I'm delighted to welcome Laura Cordwell, that many of us will have seen before from Aon. And Laura, you're going to talk to this report.
Thank you, Chair. Would you like me to share the slides, or has everybody got a copy?
Everybody's got a copy, but it may be useful to prevent screen swapping if you were to.
Yeah, no problem at all. I'll do that right now. Let's just have a look. Hopefully, you can see my screen, but if you can't see it.
Yes, we can see it, or at least I can.
Okay. Lovely. Right, I'll proceed then. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions as we go through, but again, hopefully I'll leave some time at the end as well for questions. So I think as a pension board, really what do you need to know about the valuation? You'll be interested to know that we've followed the regulations when we've been doing the process. And you'll be interested that we've also followed the sort of objectives in your funding strategy. And that the process that we went through was robust, and that we as advisors were challenged at the appropriate times by the committee and the officers when decisions were being made. So I'm happy to confirm that all of those things have taken place and have happened. We completed the valuation report on the 30th of March, which is one day ahead of the statutory deadline of the 31st. So the process has been completed now. The valuation report includes all of the certified contributions for all of the employers and what's called a rates and adjustment certificate, and those contributions will apply for the next 3 years. So yeah, we have met the regulations in terms of ensuring the fund will, well, as far as we can, ensure the fund have enough money to pay benefits as and when they fall due. So the fund is sufficiently solvent, and we're ensuring sort of long-term cost efficiency for the fund as well. In terms of fund objectives, we've been sort of looking to make sure that we try and keep contributions as sort of stable as possible for employers without taking undue risk. And I think we've met all of those objectives, but I'm happy to answer questions about those as we go through. Another thing we've done this time is there's been a new requirement for us to, under Section 13 of the Public Service Pensions Act, the Government Actuaries Department will review all of the LGPS valuations, and they're expecting the actuaries to have done some work on climate change modelling to see how resilient the fund is to future global economic scenarios and the different possible climate outcomes. So we've carried out that modelling as well, and the results of that we've provided in a big report to the officers, but also it's summarised in the valuation report that we completed at the end of March. So we've met all of those requirements. So just to recap on the work that's been done. What is evaluation? There's two main things that we need to do when we're carrying out evaluation. The first one is to take a snapshot view of the funding position as at the 31st of March 2022. And it's every 3 years, so the next one will be 31st of March 2025. It's looking at your sort of market value from your fund accounts in terms of the assets, and then comparing that to a value we place on all of the benefits that have been built up and promised as at the 31st of March 2022. And that will tell us whether there's a surplus where the assets are higher than the liabilities, or a deficit where the assets are lower than the liabilities. That determines your sort of market sort of position as at the valuation date. So that's part of the work. And then the other part is to determine the contributions that employers need to pay. And again, that's split into two parts. There's the cost of building up, of the active members building up new benefits in the fund, which is called your primary or future service contribution requirement. But then there's any adjustment to those contributions to recover your position where you have a surplus or a deficit to get you back to where you should be. So those are the things that we've been doing over the last year. So we just got a quick summary here on what's happened in terms of your membership since the last valuation, since the 2019 valuation. So your membership has been increasing, so more new members into the fund, more members turning into sort of previous members, which are called deferred members. So these are people who used to be active members, they haven't yet retired, but they've left their job and they're doing something else, and more sort of pensioner independent members as well. So ordinarily we expect that to mean liabilities will increase because you've got more members in the fund, but also on average your membership is getting older, so the fund is maturing, so on average age is going up, and where ages are on average higher, that tends to mean the fund is more expensive because there's less time to build up investment returns to meet the costs of the benefits before all those members reach pension age. So that's just to give some sort of background into what we've seen since the 2019 valuation. And how we set our assumptions for the valuation is we set our best guess of what we think inflation, will be, you know, your specific demographic assumptions like the rate of members leaving, and things like that. They're all our sort of best guess of what will happen, with the exception being our investment return assumptions. So the way we apply some prudence or caution into our valuation results is it relates to how we think your assets are going to perform over the long term. And that's quite normal across LGPS funds in how our sort of level of prudence or risk management is applied. I wasn't going to talk too much about this slide, but this is just to let you know that when we work through the valuation, we do take account of your funding strategy. The contributions that are ultimately set for employers are set by the actuaries. So me and my colleagues determine what the correct contribution levels would be. But in doing that, we need to have regard to your funding strategy, which is very much set by the committee and the officers working with us to determine what's appropriate. So it is a collaborative approach, and it isn't just us dictating what the employers should pay. And having regard to all of these elements of your funding strategy is how we've formulated the decisions for this valuation. So the level of prudence we want to take, and the or the the level of risk that we want to take in the funding strategy, relating to what do we want to, how confident do we want to be that we will beat our assumed investment return assumption. And then you've got a policy where if you consider an employer to be a higher risk of leaving the fund without without having fully funded its benefits, we can treat them a little bit differently for how we set our expectations for contributions. And there's some other things that we have. So we have an approach where you share some of the risks across employers in the fund to make it a bit fairer. And you've got a group of sort of small councils where they're sort of pulled together for setting contribution requirements and things like that. So we've done all of those things. We've taken regard to your funding strategy when we've been working through the valuations. This slide just summarises the assumptions that we've made, and the grey boxes are the sort of demographic assumptions. So these are the things that determine the timing of benefit payments mainly, or how long the benefit payments will be paid for. So you've got things like, the most important one is your life expectancy once somebody retires, or your what we call the post-retirement mortality assumption. So, how long someone's going to be receiving a pension is quite fundamental to our calculations. That's really important. But there are other assumptions that we have to make as well, and those include things like, what age will people be when they retire? How much cash will they take as a lump sum when they retire? How quickly will people, or at what rate will people leave active service and become a deferred member, because that reduces their liabilities in the fund, and what rates of ill health early retirement have you got, because those benefits are quite generous, quite expensive, so we need to make an allowance for those. Most of those are based on your experience and your membership, so we'll look at experience of your fund over the last sort of 6 years to set those assumptions, so that it does reflect what we expect to see in your fund. And some of those where we don't have enough data to set those, they'll be either based on LGPS more widely or just national statistics. And then the three sort of bluish tealy sort of colour are the key financial assumptions that we need to make. The discount rate is what we call the sort of investment return assumption that we make. And then we've got your sort of how we expect the future salaries to grow, and that becomes less important of an assumption over time as we move further and further away from sort of pre-2014 benefits. So benefits before 2014 are still linked to final pay, but benefits post 2014 are a career average, and so they don't get affected by what we assume the future pay growth will be. They just grow with inflation. And the key thing to remember here is the discount rate net of inflation is really what determines how expensive the benefits are. because we can, we could be really optimistic about what your future investment returns are going to be, but if we still think inflation is going to be really high and it's not that much higher than your investment return isn't that much higher than inflation, then given most of your benefits are linked to inflation, that's still going to make the liabilities quite high. So it's discount rate net of inflation, which is really important. Okay, just to summarise this slide, this just is very busy because we've got a lot of Welsh language translation on there as well as English. This basically just lets you know that we, for this most important demographic assumption, it is very much taken your fund data, and that's your pension data, the rates that your members have sort of passed away once they've reached retirement, but also things like your postcodes of your membership, because that's a really useful way for us to estimate sort of people's socio-economic status and therefore how long they're going to live. This is all combined together to set a very Swansea specific post-retirement mortality assumption for the valuation. And that's what we've done this year. We did that back in 2019. We've updated it again for this year. And what we've seen in this valuation is overall, very small change in actually the liabilities as a result of the changes that we've made to this assumption. So we did actually also, set an expectation for what we think the impact of the pandemic has had on future life expectancy, and that's reflected in sort of the liabilities as well. Overall, we think liabilities have reduced very slightly as a result of our new assumptions for life expectancy once you've reached retirement age. And on the assumption that we make for your investment returns, or what we call the discount rate, because the fund performed so well over the last over the last 3 years, we were in quite a good position to take some risk off the table when it came to setting the discount rate. And so we took the opportunity to do that, and also, part of this was also the sort of volatility that we were seeing around the 2022 valuation, and it felt like a good time to take some of that risk away and help make contributions a bit more stable for future. So what we did for the 2022 valuation is increase the probability of funding success. So increase the chances that we'll be fully funded in a certain number of years on the assumptions that we make. And what that means is that reduced the discount rate that we would otherwise have set slightly. But it means that in more cases we should expect to beat that investment return in more cases. So it puts the liabilities higher. It sets a lower discount rate, which means we value the liabilities higher. And the reason for that is we've got, you need to put more money into the fund now, because you're not going to, it's not going to make as much money in the future to meet the cost of those benefits. But like I say, this felt like a good time to make this decision because it should make the funding more stable over the future years. And what we really want to try and avoid is between valuations, contributions that go up for employers, and then the next valuation they go down, and then the next valuation they go up, or worst case scenario, they keep going up and up and up. So that's why we've taken this decision, this valuation. So that was a good balance between, taking risk away without making contributions unaffordable for employers. That's really important. And that decision is sort of summarised in this slide number 10. So we've got your financial assumptions that we made back in 2019 compared to the financial assumptions that we've made in 2022. Now, as I mentioned before, these are all our best guess of what we think these future financial assumptions will be, with the exception of that discount rate. So you can see we used an 80% probability of funding success in 2019. We've increased that, so we've been a little bit more cautious. We've taken a little bit of risk away for 2022, and that has resulted in a reduction to discount rate. And inflation assumption has gone up since the 2019 valuation. It was 2.1% per annum. We now expect it to be 2.3% per annum. Now, that might seem strange in the current climate, but this is very much a long-term assumption. And when we set the assumption, but early sort of last year, the 2.3% was an expectation that inflation would be 5% this year, and then sort of moving back towards the Bank of England's expectations of 2% CPI in future years. Now, it became obvious that that wasn't necessarily what was going to happen in the short term. So we made a decision with the committee and with the officers to put a short-term inflation loading onto the liabilities, because we knew the 2023 pension increase was going to be much higher than that 5% that's built into that 2.3% assumption. And also we knew that the pension increase that's going to come in 2024 is likely to be higher than that assumption as well. So rather than wait until we get to the next valuation to have a big sort of negative experience item and have a bigger deficit, we've taken allowance for what we think inflation is going to be in the short term by increasing liabilities now. So our long-term assumption is the 2.3% per annum, but we've added on an additional 10% onto the liabilities just for the next, but for this year's pension increase and for next year's pension increase, because obviously we all know inflation's still very high. And I think there was news today that over the last month it was 10.1%, so it's still over 10%. So it's looking like the pension increase for 2024 is going to be high as well. So I think that was a good decision. So when we look at,
can I ask a question? I know you have good answers. Do we know how long the interest rates are going to be this high? Do you need to understand how long the interest rates are, how are they going to be and how long for us to predict anything?
Well, so I suppose there's a difference. You may be thinking about the current sort of government interest rates on things like government bonds and things like that. That those when we set the assumptions for the valuation, those were actually it was before everything sort of all the chaos happened and they were still quite low. But what we do for the valuation is our discount rate or investment return assumption is based on what your long-term strategy is and what the market expected for each of those. So it's predominantly, because you're mainly invested in growth assets, it's quite what the interest rates were back in 31st of March 2022. They didn't have that much of an impact on our investment return assumption. It was more the growth assets. And we do need to be a bit careful, because when we're setting a investment return assumption at 31st of March 2022, it has to be something that's comparable with the market value of the assets at that time as well. So the market value of the assets were taking into account what the markets thought future returns would be. So our liabilities needed to do the same thing. So our discount rate that we've set, which is 4.1%, that takes into account what we think the individual asset classes will, or what we thought they would return over the very long term, so 20-30 years, as at 31st of March 2022. And then we apply on top of that the prudence, because we wanted to be more than 50% sure that we'll beat that investment return assumption. So it looks, while we know that interest rates are now very high, and we do need to kind of remember these are assumptions that sort of as at 31st of March 2022. I'll come into what's happened since the valuation date a little bit later. But is that okay? Does that kind of...
Yeah, cheers, thank you.
No problem. Okay, so when we're looking at our valuation results for 2022, these numbers include that those assumptions I've just talked about, including that 10% loading for inflation. So the valuation position just on the past service, so not including the cost of future benefits, 2019, the position was 92% funded. So your assets were 92% of the value of the liabilities. So the liabilities were valued higher than the assets. So the fund has performed really, really strongly since 2019, particularly on the assets. And if we hadn't been making that in 10% inflation loading, then you would have been 110% funded. So that's an 18% funding improvement. But obviously, as we know, we're having to make these allowances for inflation, which we know is coming. So the actual funding position at 2022 that we've put in your valuation report is 100%. So we need to be really positive about how well the fund's performed, but we also need to be cautious because there's so much uncertainty and because of the high inflation. So I think it's 100% is a really positive outcome. And when you put it into sort of absolute numbers, value of assets very slightly higher than the value placed on the liabilities at the valuation date. So a small surplus. Now, this slide just explains how we've, the different elements that contribute towards the new funding position. So how we ended up with a deficit of 191 million back in 2019, how that's progressed to a very small surplus of 3 million at this valuation. Now, the two big items here are your investment gain, so where your assets performed more than what we assumed at the last valuation. So outperformed considerably, which is really positive. And then the big other item working in the other direction is the, the change in the financial assumptions. And a very big part of that is that 10% inflation loading. So fund's done really well, but we are taking caution because of the high inflation environment, and we've taken a bit of risk away as well, just to help manage stability in the future. So I said the valuation is two parts. We've looked at the past service position, and now it's just time to look at the contributions that have come out of the valuation. This slide just summarises for the whole of fund what the cost of the contributions are. Individual employers will have different, these are just kind of the average. Some employers will have lower contributions, some will have higher. So the cost of benefits has increased because our discount rate net of inflation has reduced since the last valuation. But on the positive side, we were having to make an allowance for regulatory uncertainty last valuation, which is we made an allowance for the costs of McLeod and potentially cost management as well. Those things aren't a factor in this valuation. McLeod is all now in your past service liabilities, so we don't need to make an additional allowance in the contributions. So that has reduced contributions by 1.5%. And also your as a whole of fund, there is not a deficit to be recovered in your contribution rates. So that has taken the contribution rates down by, on average, 3.3% as well. So overall, the total average employer rate at the last valuation was 25%. That has reduced to 21.3% at this valuation. Now, what we talk about here is what we call a surplus buffer. Oops. And this is where what we do is, if an employer or has a funding position of over 100%, so they are in a surplus position, will only reduce their future contributions below the future service rate if they are more than 110% funded. This is something that we introduced in the 2019 valuation as a risk management approach, so that contributions don't fluctuate between valuations as much, and we've retained that at the 2022 valuation as well. So an employer will only see a reduction to their future service cost in terms of contributions if they are above 110% funded. And that's really important at this valuation because things are so volatile, particularly with inflation. And there's still a little bit of uncertainty around what will happen with cost management as well. So that helps us manage any issues that may come down in the next valuation. And if contributions have to increase, that should help manage those conversations with employers. So I think I've summarised the sort of past service and future service position. As I mentioned before, individual employer rates are all set out in the valuation report. Most employers have seen a reduction in their contributions, mainly because of their improved funding position, despite the fact that the future cost of benefits has increased. There's a lot of employers who've benefited by either not being in a deficit position anymore, or being over 110% funded, where we've been able to reduce the contributions. I won't go through this slide. It just emphasises how sensitive the fund is to our assumptions. But this is something that we've talked about before, and I think the measures that we've taken at this valuation have helped protect the fund between this valuation and the next time we do the valuation. We've got surplus buffer in place, and we've made an allowance for high inflation. So I think we've done what we can. We've taken some risk off the table in terms of reducing the discount rate, and so I do think these are all important factors for helping manage a smoother experience between valuations. Very briefly then, because my time is running out, we just sort of touched upon what's happened since the valuation date, and it's important to note that it feels strange talking about what happened the 31st of March 2022 when the valuation date is sort of as at, given that we're over a year away from that now. We know that there's been challenging market conditions since the 31st of March, and fund returns have been negative since that date. But we also know that our expectations for future returns have actually increased since that date. And so if we were to carry out the valuation sort of now, we do actually think the fund wouldn't be in a worse position than it was at 31st of March. Yes, the assets have gone down, but the liabilities have gone down as well. But we do know that inflation continues to be really high. So I think the decisions that we made around those that extra inflation loading at the valuation was really important. So hopefully it won't mean that there's any nasty surprises coming down when we do the valuation at 31st of March 2025. That's it from me. I just wanted to sort of emphasise again that as a pension board, you'll be interested about, we've met the regulations, and decisions that were made were discussed fully with the officers and with the committee. We had some really good challenging questions throughout the process, and we've taken regard to your funding strategy, and that was consulted with employers as it should be as part of the process. So employers should be aware of the changes that have been made for this valuation. But I'm happy to take any questions if there are any.
Thank you very much, Laura. I'm delighted to see the points you made about the employer's contribution. Questions for Laura? I'm not seeing any indications, but please speak up if you have any. I think, Jeff, you've got one.
Thanks, Chairman. Not a question as such. I just want to place on record, as far as the local pension board, our thanks to Laura and Eric and the team at Aon for how professionally they've discharged their duties as the appointed actuary during the last 18 months, 2 years or so, and a large part of their acceptable outcome and very agreeable outcome of the valuation is their early engagement, early discussion of these issues which were emerging at that time, and their resourceful and innovative solutions, i.e. the inflation loading, etc., to mitigate those risks and help us head it off at the pass. And just to reiterate Laura's summation of the valuation, I mean, the outcome couldn't be more positive in terms of lower contribution rates in this very difficult time for member employers, namely Swansea Council and Neath Talbot Council being the largest, and they're both experiencing material contribution reductions at this valuation. However, that's not at the risk of not at paying the price of imprudence. The actuary has been able to pull those risk levers down and reduce risk in terms of discount rate, in terms of recovery periods, and you know, a whole raft of measures that Laura's outlined. So it couldn't be a more positive outcome in terms of valuation. So again, like to thank Laura and the team for the work that they've done.
Thank you, Jeff, and I'm sure the board would like to add their thanks to that, to Laura as well. Laura, I did have one question. Do you make any assumptions about the number of employees who might perhaps opt out of the pension altogether, or perhaps go into the 50-50 scheme, which historically has not been very popular, but possibly as a result of cost of living pressures, and whether there is any evidence of sensitivity between the two?
Yes, thank you, Chair. That is a good question. We yes, we make assumptions for people opting out, and that is based on the experience that we see, and we tend to look at it over a 6-year period. So we actually we try and be a little bit cautious, because rates of people leaving the fund can be quite they can jump around, and we don't want to do anything too hasty to make, because when you assume more people leave, that makes the costs of the benefits lower. So I think the experience is that more people have left in our experience period than we've allowed for, because we're gradually moving down to that, but we don't want to be too imprudent. So each year we get closer and closer to your experience, but we don't want to go too far too quickly, because like you say, it can be so dependent on what's going on, like in a short-term period, and it's supposed to be a really long-term assumption. But yeah, we do try and take account of your specific experience. We do have an assumption for 50-50 members as well, and our assumption for that is however many are 50-50 now, they stay there, and we don't assume any more, because again, assuming people move to 50-50 is reducing the cost of the benefits, and it's more prudent. I mean, we try to take a best estimate view, but it feels safer to kind of assume they are where they are. And I take your point about it being a difficult position at the moment, but the rates of people taking 50-50 are so small anyway. It's, you know, far less than 1%. It's less than 0.5%, I think. So it's not a very material assumption, even if we did see a small increase to that. So it is actually something that the scheme advisory board, they take a much bigger view, like a bigger assumption for the number of people in the 50-50 scheme than we do, which is an interesting thing, given national statistics on it are still pretty consistent with what you see in your fund. But, yeah.
Okay, thanks, Laura. I suppose an additional concern for us would be if people opt out, become used to living on that level of income, it's the push for them to return to the scheme. So perhaps that's something myself and Mr. White need to bear in mind as well when speaking to our members.
Yeah, and if I may, Chair, another reason why we don't make drastic assumptions about that is because of auto enrolment. So if somebody opts out, they'll be put straight back in 3 years and have to opt out again anyway. So that's why we kind of think that the current levels will probably be retained, because if people come out in the short term because of cost pressures, we'd hope they go away in the next 3 years. But yeah, can I just make a just brief point based on just to summarise? I think, thank you, Jeff, for your lovely comments about the work that we did, but you know, it wouldn't have been possible without the officers, and in particular the quality and speed at which we were given the membership data. The team did an absolutely brilliant job, and we wanted to acknowledge that. We got it way earlier than any of the other funds we work with, so that, you know, our clients at Aon. So I think that's fantastic, and the quality was excellent. So that's down to the employers as well. So yes, thank you on record for that. It's brilliant.
Thank you, Laura. And again, perhaps the board could add our thanks and congratulations, Jeff, to you and your team, and perhaps you could pass that on to the members of the team that aren't present today.
Quite happy to do so. Thank you, those members, Chairman, and Laura.
Thank you, Laura. you're very free to stay and watch the rest of the meeting, but if you've got anywhere else you want to be, just thank you very much for the hard work you've done and presenting the report today.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, everybody. I will leave you now, so you don't need an actuary button into all your business for the rest of your meeting. Thank you very much, and we'll speak soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
I think we've got about 5 minutes left. So, Jeff, is there any particular part of the agenda, your reports, that you'd want to prioritise given the time we've got left, rather than just going through the agenda in order? I'm in your hands.
No, Chairman. The one item I would like to speak to is in closed session, so I'll wait until that item of the agenda is passed before I move into it. If that's okay, Chairman.
It certainly is. So going back, fortunately for me, going back to the agenda in order, item 4A is the draft funding strategy. Your report's been circulated, Jeff, and I'm assuming everybody has read it. Do you have anything you want to add to it?
I think Laura has touched on it, why it's important, why it sets out the framework in which she conducted her evaluation. Changes are highlighted in yellow within the report since the last time it was brought before board. As you say, it's there for board to consider for information.
Yes. Any questions on this item for Jeff? I'm sorry, seeing no indications, and it's an information item for us, so we've received that. The item 4C on the agenda is the pension fund business plan, and again, in the same way we've received it. Jeff, anything to update or add?
Nothing to add, Chairman. That's as normal business. That includes the budget, risk register, and action plan for the forthcoming year.
Very well. Anybody have any questions? I'm seeing none, but please do call out if I've missed anything. The breaches report as a standing item, and again, in the same way, Jeff, anything you want to add to it?
Nothing to add, Chairman. Is the usual report that board receives.
Any questions? No, so we received that for information. Trustee training, very pertinent for us, although of course we're not technically trustees. Jeff, the dates and everything are there. Anything you want to add?
Nope. Obviously now, as we're moving out of the post-COVID environment, there shall be more opportunities for in-person training now. I know, Chairman, you've attended quite a few previously. So as they start being arranged, I shall circulate to local pension board members for their consideration and attendance in due course.
Thank you, Jeff. And yes, that face-to-face is a good side benefit. Was there something you wanted to say, Jeff?
No, nothing further, Chairman.
Any questions? I'm seeing none, so we'll receive that. And the next item is the exclusion of the public. You'll see the reasons there and the legal advice. Before we take a vote, does anybody have any questions on the legal advice? I'm seeing no indications. So if somebody could move that we go into private session for the reasons given.